Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to talk with you and share some ideas. My goal is to first talk about what are some things that have been going on in cognitive sciences that will impact how we teach in the classroom. So I certainly want us to leave today with some concrete tools that you can use right away in the classroom. But before we do that, I want to talk about some of these dead ideas. These are things that have been lingering around. We probably have done them. We might still be doing some of these things, or even have some of these preconceived notions about learning and the brain. And so that's what we want to tackle today. So before I get started on the content, take just a second here to kind of reflect on my pretest. And there's actually a reason why I want to do this, and I'll come back to the reason why I want to give you a pretest, but this is the pretest. Why are you watching this presentation? And what's one thing you hope to get from this presentation that you can use in your classroom? So I want you to keep those questions in your mind. If you don't have an answer, that's okay, but keep those questions in your mind as we progress through our presentation. It probably goes without saying, the brain is a very funny place. As a teacher, we're going to be impacting a student. We're going to have to draw their attention, present material, hope they listen, hope they understood, hope they remembered it. And that's obviously some of the myths and some of the issues we're going to tackle today. But before I do that, just to kind of prove my point that the brain is this funny place, I want to show you this slide and this quote. I'm sure there's some Star Wars fans out there. Luke, I am your father. Now, it just so happens that my son's name is Luke. I think he hears this, he's asked this question, probably 3 times a day. But you probably remember this line from the Star Wars movie. The interesting thing about that is that line was never in the movie. It is no, I am your father. But all of us would swear, and we all hear that quote all the time, that Luke, I am your father. But it actually never came from the movie. This is an example of what a group of scientists have called the Mandela effect. And it started in around 2009. These group of researchers were getting together and they were discussing this South African revolutionary. We know that's Nelson Mandela, but he died in 2013. In 2009, several of the scientists were talking about his death. It had occurred before that. They remembered seeing news coverage. They remembered him dying in prison in the 80s. But the facts were just different. He was in prison for 27 years. He was a president of South Africa until 1999. And again, he died in 2013. But the scientists were so sure that he had died before that, and they just couldn't understand why everyone had this memory of something else happening. They did some more research. Again, long story short about this is that they called this the Mandela effect. And it's explaining why our memories are very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to remembering and forgetting, and they're vulnerable to misremembering facts. One more example here, because I love this one. We just passed the Thanksgiving timeframe. I'm sure many of you had stuffing for Thanksgiving meal, but do you remember ads that this was in the 80s and 90s about Stouffer's stovetop stuffing? I remember ads about commercials about Stouffer's stovetop stuffing. But what's interesting to know about that is that there's never been anything called Stouffer's stovetop stuffing. It's always been Kraft. The box always had Kraft on the label. The commercials always said Kraft, but so many of us probably remember or would swear that it was Stouffer's, and it's just not the case. So again, just a funny example of the Mandela effect, and to illustrate that, again, our brains are kind of a funny place. Now, what is a dead idea? So these are ideas that are not true, but they're often believed and they're embedded in how we teach. And another word for this is a neuromyth. A neuromyth is a commonly held false belief about how the brain and mind function. And we want to specifically look at neural myths in teaching. So these are teaching practices, they're ideas or techniques that don't actually have a scientific basis in neuroscience. So these are neural myths in teaching. And I want to talk about some of these. The first one is pretty easy because I know you've heard this before. If you're a math-oriented, you're left-brained, and if you're very creative, you're right-brained. I know we've heard that before. The truth is that this is a myth. There really are no right brain or left brain people. We have one brain, we have two hemispheres, they work together for most functions, but there's not really, a specific part of the brain that can say this is the math part, or a specific part that says this is the artistic part. And this probably came around, you've probably seen this drawing before from the 1800s. This was what they said at the time was a science called phrenology, and they divided the brain into 27 different areas, and each one, they said, would function on its own. But today, we don't use this kind of language. We don't use this kind of localization for the brain. It's talked about more in terms of like in the IT networking world. So the brain is more like areas of these nodes or hubs. And we've also know that the brain, we've moved away from this localization to what is now called neuroplasticity. And actually, this is really interesting because when you learn something, you're literally physically changing your brain. And this is that neuroplasticity. All right, let me go over another myth. Would you say this is true or false? Because I know you've heard of this. Students learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. Is that true or false? And again, just to review, you've probably taken a test to identify your learning style. The three most common ones are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Students would say, I'm a more visual learner, I have to see it. Or some would say I'm more physical, I need to move and manipulate things. That's how I learn best. And you can take tests and you can, and I did this too. I did this both as a teacher. I would give tests to my students to see what their learning styles were. And I would also, as a student over the years, take these kind of tests. So the issue here is that, asking students to reflect how they learn best, that's a great way for a student to develop what's called metacognitive skills. In other words, they kind of think about their learning, think about their thinking. But to pigeonhole them into one particular category or style or type of learner based on answers that are really from just a very short little quiz, I would say is actually a bit irresponsible. The research is very clear on this, and this is what's a bit amazing. It's clear on this that this is a myth. It's probably the most prevalent neuromyth that we have today, and that is that it is a myth that people have learning styles. It is true they have a learning preference, but it is a myth to say they have a style, and when they're taught that way, they learn better. There was a study done almost 15 years ago that looked at all of the research on learning styles that was available. And they actually found that there were about 471 different identified styles that they called learning styles. But this was their finding in this study. It's that if classification of students' learning styles has practical utility, it remains to be demonstrated. In other words, this is a myth. So if you take nothing else away in terms of different myths and dead ideas, take this one away in your teaching, is that it's a myth to think that students learn better when they're taught in a style that they have identified. Again, it is true we all have a preference, but it doesn't increase learning. I wanted to throw this up here because I think this is one of the, I love this title of a journal article, one of the best journal titles I've ever seen. The difference between Bigfoot and learning styles. There may be better evidence to support the existence of Bigfoot. Now, what's the big deal here? So attending to different needs and differentiating classroom instruction, these are good ideas. And telling a student that their style of learning, what their style of learning is, I feel can actually do more harm. And in some ways it will stunt their learning. And why is that? Well, we pigeonhole and we stereotype students when we do this. We also, most of us are pressed for time. We kind of waste time and effort trying to test students and identifying their learning styles. And third, students may think that they're incapable of learning in different styles based on their, what their preferences might be. So again, all of this persists without even a single study to prove that learning styles actually work. And there's been multiple publications to debunk this myth. So really, again, the biggest negative here is that both teachers and students believe that their academic achievement is tied to their style. It's just not true. Okay. All right, how about this question? Students know when they're learning, and expert teaching can increase student learning. Would you say that's true or false? When we sit in a class and we read and we study and we listen, we feel as though we are learning. Our EMS classrooms, many of you I know teach in a kind of an academy style format. They may be cadets. It's almost a militaristic based classroom environment. They are attentive for the most part. They are taking notes. They're engaged in what appears to be learning. Even if you teach in a classroom like this is a medical school classroom, highly capable, intelligent students all are engaged, they're enthralled, they're hanging on your every word as a teacher. And I love to teach. I love to be in front of a classroom. And I feel like I'm a pretty good judge of when students are paying attention or not paying attention. And so there's been a recent study that looks at this feeling of learning. And I will say too, let me go back to this slide. Most of you, you're teaching, you're training, you're working with your coworkers and colleagues and students, and you're trying to teach them something. And we want to do a good job. And we feel like that is an active learning process. But how do we know for sure? So this is an interesting study. It was done at Harvard, and it was an introductory physics course. And so they compared how we learn and how we learn best. So they had two study conditions. In those conditions, there was a standard lecture, and it was also given by someone who was well-versed in the subject. They understood the subject matter. They were well-trained in terms of how to deliver this very complex information to students who were new to this subject. So two groups. In both conditions, they had a standard lecture, and the students then, after they heard these lectures, they would have worksheets, and they completed them and worked through questions, problem-solving type worksheets. But the only difference was that when they came to solve this problem and use this worksheet, one group listened to the lecture and were explained how to solve the problem, and instructors would show them examples on how to solve the problem. So they were taught by a direct teach method, by a lecture on how to do the worksheet. The other group, though, when it came time to solve the problem, they got into small groups and they worked together. They weren't specifically told by the instructor on how to do it, but they let the students work through them, discuss. The instructor would walk around and answer questions when they were there. But this was the second condition. So at the end, all groups were tested on their learning, but they were also asked about their feeling of learning. And these were the results. On their feeling of learning, so you can see that there's the passive, which is just the lecture, and then the active, where they got into small groups. The active learning, This is in the dark bar, and the passive is in this lighter gray bar. You can see that students enjoyed the lecture more. So they asked this question: did you enjoy the lecture? Those that were in the passive condition actually enjoyed it more. Did they feel like they learned a great deal from this lecture? Again, the passive group felt like they learned more than the active group. The instructor was effective at teaching. Again, the passive group felt more so than the active. And then they also asked that they said that they wished that all of their physics courses were taught the same way, this passive way, where the instructor is up front, lecturing, presenting material. But again, when they tested their learning, the results were exactly the opposite. So here is a result of testing their learning, their actual learning. The active group learned significantly higher, about 10% higher. So what this shows is that there's this mismatch between how we feel we learn and how we actually learn best. And the more active the student is, the more active the learner is in the learning process, that's when they learn best. If you've taught any active learning strategies in your classrooms, you likely get pushback. And this is why. Because I've heard comments from students like, well, I'm just teaching myself. The instructor is not teaching us anything. We have to do all the work. To which I would say, yes, that is true. So here's what to know, that teaching really doesn't equal learning. Or to say it another way, that being taught doesn't equal learning. We have to take an active role in the learning process. So these results, very compelling on this one. I know it's one study, but other studies have replicated this exact same thing. They've looked at younger learners, older learners, if they're in a formal environment, a training environment, business versus academic, or whether they're learning in groups or learning independently. Every time that these results have been replicated in those conditions. So what's to take away from this? The key is that the more you try to immediately apply what you're taking in, the more you're able to retain it by struggling with it. And that's the key word. There was a group in that group that performed better in those conditions where they had to work a little bit. They had to talk and discuss and look things up and ask questions and solve the problem together in an active way. This is called desirable difficulties. It was a term, it's in the literature. It was first written by a cognitive scientist named Robert Bjork. But there's a similar term to this, to desirable difficulty, is what's called a productive struggle. So as teachers, we need to be transparent. Let your students, let your class know your intentions. I'm about to give you something that I want you to work on. I want you to struggle with it. I want you to talk about it. I have to look things up, because when you do that, it helps you learn, it helps your brain turn on, and it helps you retain that information longer. So just be upfront with your students and tell them, this is why I'm doing it. I'm not doing it so I can let y'all work and I go take a break. I'm going to be here to help. But this is a proven way, even though you may like for me just to stand in front and lecture, it's proven that this bit of a struggle, it will pay off. So again, when that other condition, when you're just listening and you don't really want to call it being entertained, but one thing I do know, that as all of you are in the education field in some way, one thing I know about all of you is that you're all a bunch of nerds. I am in that category as well, because you like to learn. You like to learn more than just the textbook, or you'll go detailed into the textbook. You're not afraid to ask questions, because as a teacher, you have a heart for learning. But if you're not actively doing anything with that information, it just gets lost. So even if you are, quote unquote, a good student, that you're paying attention and you're actively engaged just by listening, you still have to take that activity to a different level and actually do something with that, struggle with it. And there is a term for this. It's called the illusion of fluency. And we need to help our students overcome this illusion because it can be so deceiving and really prevent a better learning and better recall of our information. So when students use current performance as evidence of test readiness, and they don't realize that the study condition won't be the same as the testing condition, this is called the illusion of fluency. And if you want to be really fancy, it's called the cognitive bias of illusory superiority. And sometimes some of you may have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And that's when we have just a little bit of knowledge, we overestimate our level of expertise. In other words, we don't know what we don't know. And that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the problem is, even if we give students, or students typically choose some other things to do to overcome this, like they create their own study aids, they make a study guide, they outline their chapter. Those activities can cause us to misjudge the depth of what we know. And that gives me a point to show you an example of our next myth, highlighting. I'm talking about just old-fashioned, take the highlighter and highlight notes, highlight your textbook. Is highlighting a technique that improves learning? Well, if this were just a few years ago, research was saying that we probably should just not use the highlighter, because the better way to do this is just to read some material, go away from it, take a break, rephrase it in your mind, try to explain it to someone else, just do something with it. But here is kind of where the current research is on highlighting. And the value of the highlighting really comes down to what your purpose is, your intention. Remember, the pretest that I asked you about. When you are upfront about what your intention is, that makes highlighting more valuable. So before you pick up your notes or before you read and highlight the text, set your intention. Why are you reading this block of material? Why are you reading this section in the chapter? When you do that, when you're reading intentionally, or you're watching a video with intention, you're looking for something specific and you're trying to exploit that for your own purposes. And when you do that, that's when activities like this are much better to improve your learning. So whatever your intention is, just utilize or exploit the tools that you have around to meet that goal. As a teacher, then, tell your students to do this. When they go and they're going to study notes or study the text, and typically we have this conversation. I know you can imagine a time you give an exam. This is in the traditional academic world, has been finals week for the last week or two, or for some of you coming up. And that student, bombs the exam, and they come in and they want to talk about, why did they do poorly? And they're going to say, oh yes, I studied so hard. I read all the chapter. I reread the chapter. I took notes. I highlighted. Again, that's that illusion of fluency, that illusion of that they really know it because they did something. Yes, they were active in highlighting, but they weren't intentional with it. So make sure you teach students to be intentional. In other words, don't just highlight it because it looks like something you should highlight. It should look like something to highlight because that's answering some questions that you go into the reading with. Hard to do, I know, but this is what the research is showing. I will tell you that the best way to avoid the illusion of fluency is testing. So if I said, hey, is there a way to help a student avoid this illusion of fluency? Don't you want to help your students' abilities transfer the learning in the field, help them become aware of their strengths and weaknesses of learning? This is it. Testing is the best way to overcome this illusion. And the good thing about this is that it's also an effective study technique in its own right. So by testing, I don't just mean give, 2 or 3 or 4 exams and a final exam in your course, but do frequent low stakes testing every day. And there's another reason for that too, and we'll share that in just a minute. This is an article that was published in 2013. And what they did is that they took all of these techniques that have been shown to work with learning, to improve learning, help students with the material, and they actually put a table together and they ranked the effectiveness of all the things that have been shown to be at least somewhat effective in the sciences. And practice testing, frequent testing is the top. So think of it as a pretest. You can do a pretest. The pretest is just an introduction to what the students are going to learn. And that initial exposure seems to help students answer related questions on later exams. So think of the pretest as just a way to prime the brain. It's also interesting to note that a lot of times students do know some of these techniques, but they don't necessarily take our advice on some of these effective ways to study. And why is that? Well, these researchers discovered that students will adopt these strategies that make them feel more secure in the short term. So reading a chapter and going back and rereading the chapter makes them feel like they did something. It makes them feel like they studied. And by the way, that's probably exactly what they did throughout their years in school. Students also find it hard to accept more effective strategies because they may impair their performance for a while. In other words, it takes a little bit of work and there's a little bit of pain involved because first of all, they're doing something that they don't feel like that is effective because they hadn't done it before. And they may feel like, you know, I don't have time to create my own little tests. I don't have time to think about intention because I'm cramming tonight for the test tomorrow. So that's another reason why. So those articles really came up with a great conclusion. Make it clear to students that the standard of knowing is the ability to explain to others. It's not the understanding when explained by others. Let's go over that again because this is really important. Make it clear to students that the standard of knowing is the ability to explain to others. It's not the understanding when explained by others. In other words, students feel like they understood it because they were explained to in a clear way, but that's not the standard. It's really be able to explain it back to someone else. So what are some what I call zombie killer ideas? What are some things, again, that you can take away and use in your classroom today? The first one is retrieval practice. Just like this is similar to that pre-testing or frequent testing. Retrieval practice is the act of trying to recall information without having it in front of you. It's deliberately recalling information that forces us to pull our knowledge out and examine what we know. It's asking questions. It could be just asking a question at the beginning of class. It could be actual low stakes exams. Remember, these are ways to study, not necessarily tests, but ways to study. And you're probably thinking, well, this is nothing new because these are like flashcards. The whole concept of a flashcard is built on retrieval practice, and flashcards have been around forever. But there has been new research actually on how to use these, and they've been comparing retrieval practice with other methods of studying, strategies like review lectures, study guides, rereading your text. And what they find is that nothing cements long-term learning as powerfully as retrieval practice. There are studies that have specifically looked at ways to retrieve. This was just quickly to review this, a study. Students had to listen to 3 30-minute art history lectures, and they came back a week later to take a test. One group just had no activity. So they had the lectures, and a month later they took a test. and they scored the lowest. So that was no activity. But what was the highest scores on the test a month later were those who studied by making short answer quizzes as they went along. So again, what this is and what other studies have shown is that it's good to have people practice remembering, but it's better to have them remember and do something. We remember what we think about. Those activities help us remember. You've probably heard of the minute paper, where you just ask students a question like, what was the most important thing you learned today? Take a minute, write down everything that you felt was most important. So that's an example of using memory. So they're retrieving things that they learned during that lecture or during the day, and they're having to write it out and think about it. So students have to recall and make a judgment on what they've learned. Quick, easy activity you can do that is an example of retrieval practice. Just focus less on putting information in. As teachers, that's what we typically focus on. Our content, our PowerPoint slides, how do we explain it? I have to cover every bit of information. I have to go down every chapter. We have to cover everything. Instead, focus on getting information out. And how do we do that? Again, an oldie but a goodie is this think, pair, and share. So what you can do is at the beginning of a class for a think, pair, share, again, it's quick, low maintenance, have them recall. So just group up with a partner and use this single question, make it something very open-ended. So before we start, can anyone remind me what we talked about in class on Monday? So pause for a minute, let the students individually think about that and say, now turn to your partner and tell them what we talked about on Monday. And trust me, the first time you do this, you will be exceptionally disappointed because you'll realize how little they actually remembered on Monday. But that's because they haven't been practicing this. Once they get good about it, it's just like the pretest. They'll know, you know what, I'm paying a little bit better attention today because I'm going to need this information in the future. So another example is, before I discussed the medications to raise blood pressure, what were the medications we discussed that lowered the heart rate? So have them think about that. Again, retriever, we're pulling some information out. Another quick example, does anyone remember the case we discussed involving the patient who fell at home and had an altered LOC? What were the important vital signs that we discussed? So again, retrieval practice, this is not the same as an assessment. Although some retrieval activities might allow you to formatively assess the student understanding, but remember that this retrieval practice is a learning activity in and of itself. I would say don't assign points, or maybe just very, very few points, very minimal points if you want to. Sometimes giving a few points makes a student pay a little bit better attention, but again, just low stakes, low to no points. So those were opening questions. What about closing questions? Let's say you gave a presentation and then you just ask the class, write down the most important concept from the day and one question that remains in your mind, or just give a short quiz on the material that you just covered. So just remember that don't let them use books, don't let them use notes. It's not a race. It's not a scavenger hunt. You want them to actively struggle, desirable difficulty, retrieving information out. Let them feel that tension a little bit of having to pull that information, think back about what they've been learning. Retrieval practice, frequent quizzing. So just give frequent low stakes quizzes, and just as some ideas of technologies for your classroom, you can use Google Forms, you can use the clickers, you can use Poll Everywhere, you can use Kahoots, Quizlets. All of these things are ways that you can give some quizzes to the class. Again, very low points if you do assign points. Another example of a retrieval practice activity is called a brain drain or a brain dump. So just have students get out a sheet of paper and within a certain length of time, write down everything that they know about a topic of study. So whatever you're going over, just have them write down everything that they can come up with. And you can do this at the beginning of a unit or at a midpoint just to reinforce some of the learning, or you can do it at the very end of a unit, depending how long it is. But once students have completed their list, their brain drain, then they could exchange them, go back to a think, pair, share, and use them to compile, kind of a whole class brain dump. So you can put everything together into one big Google Doc and share that with everybody. Again, don't use it as a grade, keep it no stakes. And again, be transparent. Tell them the reason I'm doing this, I'm not trying to waste time, I'm not trying to embarrass people. I'm trying to have you struggle a little bit because that's going to help you learn and expose maybe what you don't know or don't remember. Another word about flashcards, because there has been research on flashcards and we know it's a powerful retrieval tool, but what happens is that students, when they use flashcards, it's the same problem that illusion of fluency. They don't stick with the card quite long enough. Again, teach students how to do this because students tend to drop the cards out of their deck as soon as they've mastered them. So research actually shows that a fact should be successfully retrieved 3 times before a student should move on. So they actually have to retrieve it. So tell students, when you look at, let's say you have a definition on the front, just a word, and on the back of the card is a definition. Students will look at that word and say, okay, apnea. Oh yeah, I know what that is. And then move on. But encourage them, take their time. Really, are you sure? Put that in a complete sentence. Tell your partner, just verbalize it out loud. What is the definition? And then confirm it by having them look at it. Have them shuffle the deck. Because if you keep it in the same order, like an alphabetized list, that also makes them more predictable. So shuffle the cards. And flashcards don't have to be reserved for that low level of Bloom's learning. They can be higher order things. Ask questions, ask ethical questions, professional behavior questions, scenario questions. Those can be done on flashcards as well. So they're not just for low level activities. So the important concept here is that within your brain, retrieval is constructive. And that means that every time you retrieve a memory, it becomes deeper, it becomes stronger, and it's easier to access in the future. And I just give the analogy is just imagine that there's a memory that's in this isolated cabin out in the woods, and it's surrounded by untouched trees and high grass. And the first time you travel to that cabin, you have to forge a path. You have to go through the high grass. You have to cut down the brush. But the more you travel that path, the more obvious, the more etched out that path becomes. With enough retrieval, this path eventually becomes a road. It becomes a superhighway. And then it leads straight to that memory and there's nothing blocking the path. So this is why students can more easily remember details about their top Netflix series that they're watching because they talk about it with their friends, their family, they chat about it, they go to websites, they discuss it out, in other situations other than just watching the movie. They're retrieving those memories and they're continually making these roads to those memories. And as much as we hate to admit it, they're not as easily forming those memories with drip formulas and drug doses and rhythm interpretations unless we're working on it. So again, be upfront and be transparent with your students on why we're doing that. Metacognition is having students think about their learning, think about their thinking. And we do that in a couple ways. So encouraging students to examine how they think. Ask them, what do I already know about this topic that could guide my learning? What was the most confusing to me about the material that we discussed in class? Again, ask students after exams. Unfortunately, that may be too late, but ask them what went well, what activities did you do when you studied that helped you prepare? And what are things that didn't work? And almost always students will say, I read the material, I went back, I read it again, I read it a third time, I highlighted text, I went back and looked at my notes. Those things are not very effective. They're very ineffective. And that's that illusion of fluency. So again, help students reach their own conclusions about how they're studying and why they're studying and what works and what doesn't work. Because again, teaching doesn't mean learning. Feeling good about it doesn't mean learning, but being active, doing something is what promotes and encourages learning. Don't be afraid to have a classroom that looks like this. Don't be afraid, because in a classroom like this, there's no real front of the classroom. Students are working together. They're working in groups, working in teams. There's an excellent book called TeamBased Learning. It's been around for several years, and there's one specific for healthcare education. And it talks about how we can have students working in groups and teams to promote learning, promote active learning. And you have to be transparent when you do these things, because if you don't tell students why you're doing it, their feeling is it's something that they don't like. They don't want to have to engage with their classmates. They don't want to have to do group projects. They don't, they just feel like they learn better if they just sit there and listen to you, entertain them. They may like that. It may be because it's ultimately easier to do that for them, harder for you. But don't be afraid to go into and to try some of these things. Put them in groups, do active learning, retrieval practice activities. And that leads to really the final potential myth, and that is that great teachers are naturally great, and they're just born that way. I will say that I'll tell you up front, this is just false. However, we have a challenge, because you probably recognize this movie. This is Professor Keating and Dead Poets Society. And we think about the powerful college teacher who, you know, students are just hanging on your every word, and you can, in this case, you can get down and the students, it's like Socrates, you know, they're surrounding you and they're listening and hanging on every word, and you're making a lifelong impact. That might happen, but it is exceedingly rare. We even see in the movies, in the School of Rock, you know, here's this, a guy gets kicked out of his band, he's lazy, and he becomes a substitute teacher. And all of a sudden, you know, here's this, you know, lazy bum who just happens to completely transform an entire school, and certainly this classroom, just because of his love and interest of rock music. And even when we have classrooms like this, where we have huge lecture halls, and we lecture and we know that we're presenting the material just right. All of those are skills that take time to develop. And this, please know, is certainly a myth. Great teachers are not naturally great. We're built. We have to work on it. Again, be transparent with your techniques. Tell them why you're doing these active learning strategies. Give them study strategies. And acknowledge that they may prefer a more passive approach, but you want to help them learn and remember. One other zombie killer idea, just something to consider, just two more before, as we close. There is a way of changing your grading. Make it what's called specifications grading or contract grading. And the reference here is a book by Linda Nilsson called Specifications Grading. And here, the students are graded really pass-fail on most of the individual assignments. And they're given opportunities to revise their work, revise any submissions, but you have to give very clear, detailed instructions. So here's an example of a specifications grading course that I teach. It is in a physical examination. So I tell them up front, if you want a grade of C and you don't want anything else, you're happy with a C, this is what you have to do to make a C. And you may think, well, I'm selling out because I'm really making this too easy. But I've decided what a C level work is. I decided that if they do these 2 important modules and they take the 2 exams, and there's also quizzes and things like that, but notice that the minimum grade is an 80. They have to make an 80, not a 70. And if they don't make an 80, they have to retest it. They have to do these discussion posts. They had to do 2 specific detail. And this is a detailed history and physical exam. I use a textbook that a lot of PA programs use. And then they have to do a very concluding lesson. So this is the specification. I'm setting that if you do this work, obviously, if you do these lessons and you do these assessments, they have to be done correctly. But if you do that, I'm fine to give you a grade of C. And if you learn nothing else, I would hope that you'd want to go on and try for a B or an A. But if you did nothing else, I'm okay to say this student with a grade of C has learned something very important, minimally important, but good enough for a C. But if you want to do a grade, you have to do all that C work, and then you have to do another module, another exam, a different kind of discussion post, and a different kind of patient assessment. And by patient assessment, again, actually doing one and submitting a patient care report. So this is specifications. And one good thing about this is that students see up front what they got to do. They know that this is the work that it takes. They even feel like, you know, this is a busy point in my life. I can't get an A, but I'll get a C. And when I get to that point, that's the grade I'm going to make. It took me a while as a teacher to accept that. Another zombie killer idea is think about changing what your syllabus looks like. I know that many of us do a syllabus that's, you know, our schools and our institutions tell us a special format that we have to follow. But when you have a syllabus that looks like this, it just becomes more like a legal document. You know, there's more policies than content. There's really nothing to inspire them. There's really nothing for them to want to go back and look. How many times do we say, you know, it's in the syllabus? Well, make it a document that they want to go back to. And it really looks more like a contract and what to do, not to do, and what all the penalties are going to be. So what if you made your syllabus look a little more like a marketing flyer? Make it readable. Put pictures instead of just saying, here's how you make an A, B, or C. Put it in a pie chart format. They can visualize a little bit. Okay, wow, these are in yellow are the exams. So most of the grade is going to come from the exam. Just visualize what you typically put in verbal form. Make it more readable. Also, your students will have a little better sense of, you know what, the teacher's excited about this. The teacher really likes this material, and you know, maybe I can be excited about it too. So go back. Remember, we did a pretest. And think about some of the things that you're hoping to get out of this presentation. Reflect on that. Think about using some of these techniques, these activities, these skills in your own classroom. Try it today. If you have a lecture today or tomorrow or just the next time you're going to be in front of students, ask them at the very beginning, what did we talk about? What did you, even if it wasn't your class, you can say, what did y'all talk about last week? Or at the end of your time with the students, just ask them, what did you learn today? And continue to do that. Let them, again, for you as a teacher, focus more on getting information out and less on putting it in. So I hope you learned a few things. Neuroscience is really making inroads. It's hard for us to follow because it's not in our field, but the literature is telling us how students learn best. And you know, gone are the days of just putting up PowerPoint and you know, trying to cover every single slide that's in your the slide deck. But so I encourage you to try some of these techniques out. And we have a few more minutes. I'm happy to stay around and answer questions. Please, if you have any questions or suggestions, or you tried something and it worked or didn't work, email me or call me. I'd love to talk to you about it.
All right. Thank you so much, Lance, for your presentation. Like you said, we can leave this open for a few minutes here and see if anybody comes in with any questions.
Okay.
But everyone else, please check out the link I sent in the chat. It is to register for the CEU. But if you missed the link today, that's not a problem. It will go out in tomorrow's follow-up email. So thank you, everybody, for attending. And we will see you next time.
The question is, what was the patient assessment guidelines for that that book on specifications grading? It was just titled that, Specifications Grading by Nielsen, Linda Nielsen, N-I-L, Nielsen.
Anybody else have any other questions? Okay, it looks like there's a question in the Q&A there. All right, Joe asks, thanks for the update. Do you have a printable, shareable top 10 list for teaching?
As far as like top 10 kind of techniques or something like that, yes, I can. I guess, will you put out this?
Yeah, if you can email that to me, I can send that out tomorrow as well.
Sure. I'll put the PowerPoint as a PDF. I'll include I'm going to add a references page, and then I'll also include kind of some of the top 10 things.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Tools or tips. Yeah, happy to do that.
All right. Well, in that case, I think we're good to wrap it up here.
Okay.
All right. So I will close it out, and thank you again, everybody. And one more question. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, we do have a question. I've only been recently become involved in teaching on a local EMT program. Am I eligible to become a member? Oh, a member of NEMSI, Mark? Because in that case, yes, anybody can join. You're absolutely more than welcome to. And I can send you a link if you would like. All right, Mark, I just sent a link in the chat to join NEMSI. All right, so now I officially think we're good. All right, so I will close it out, and thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.